Today on Better Book Clubs, are you well read? Wow, that's a really loaded question. I think a lot of us who are readers, though, ask it about ourselves at one point or another. Am I well read? Today I want to talk about one quality in particular that I think you absolutely must have if you're going to become a well-read reader. But before I do that, let's kind of unpack this term a little bit, because what does it even mean to be well-read? One pretty common definition, I think, of being well-read is that you've read a lot of the classics, by which I mean the kinds of books that are considered to be part of the Western canon, from Homer to Shakespeare to Emily Dickinson. I mean, once you start naming names, you very quickly run into territory where people might not agree on what belongs and what doesn't belong in the Western canon. And so that's sort of a problem right there. If you set out to become well-read by reading the canon, it's hard to determine what the canon is. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that if you read exclusively in that field of the classics, of classic literature, you may not actually be well-read. You're just really well-read in that kind of reading. So for example, you might be neglecting all of the new books that everybody's talking about that may ultimately themselves become classics. I think that's another potential definition of what it means when somebody says, oh, so-and-so is so well read. Often what they're talking about is somebody who's reading a lot of the books that everybody's talking about. Those books that everybody's talking about are coming fewer and farther between because our reading experience has been so splintered by social media and by the way we get our books. So we don't just go to a bookstore or a library anymore. We have all of these online options for finding books. But there are still books. I'm thinking, for example, about Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast that came out a couple of years ago that everybody seems to be talking about at the same time. And so another possible definition of a well-read person is somebody who's reading those books that are folded into the conversation of our day and are able to speak to them. The interesting thing that happens if you do that over time, over 20, 30, 40, 50 years of reading, is that you become a sort of storehouse of the most crucial books of every reading season, and you might even become one of those people who's read already the first time around the books that become sort of start to sit inside of classic status. Another possible way, though, to define a well-read person is somebody who's reading across genres. So you're not just reading novels, you're not just reading the works of the day, but you're reading broadly in science and history and politics and religion, as well as fiction and poetry and drama. So somebody who's reading broadly across the genres might also be what you would consider well-read. Somebody who might perform really well on Jeopardy, for example, because they've read in so many different areas. They have some level of expertise across a broad spectrum. Another category of books that I don't know if this would make you well-read. I guess it would make you well-read in a cultural sense that I hadn't really thought about until I started doing research for this video, was a list that I found on the Library of Congress site of the most influential books. I think they were the most influential books of the 20th century. They were books that don't show up on that Western canon list, and they probably don't typically show up on the list of what well-read people have read, and yet they are extremely important books in terms of thinking about how they've influenced our culture. So just to give you a couple of examples from that list, one of them was Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care book that so many copies, millions and millions and millions of copies were sold, and so many parents consulted over time about how to raise their children. Another one was the book that AA uses, and the official title is The Story of How More Than 100 Men Have Recovered from Alcoholism. That was the initial title that really kind of launched that whole AA movement that, as we know, has been extremely influential in a lot of people's lives. Another one was Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which of course you've probably heard of, but maybe not thought of as something that a person who's well-read would have read. I also noticed that a lot of places and people and articles defined well-read not just in terms of what you read, but also how you read it. So adjectives came up in describing a well-read reader that you might want to consider. Words like thoughtful, intelligent, flexible, purposeful, curious, deliberate, patient, and so on. So words to describe somebody who's well-read and the way they approach not only their reading, but also their decision about what they're going to read next. One thing I didn't see mentioned in any of these sources, but that I think is really important to being a well-read reader, and it's a quality I don't have and I wish I did, was having a really good memory. Because I think the people I know who I would consider to be really well-read are people who remember what they read, and then they're able, because they have that storehouse in their memory, they're able to synthesize things. So they read the next thing and they're able to make connections back to other things they've read. If you don't have a good memory, then after you read a book, you forget most of it and it doesn't become part of your mental library of what you've read, and therefore it's pretty hard to be a well-read person. So you might want to also think about what you can do to supplement your own memory in order to become more well-read. But there's actually one other quality that I think is even more important to becoming a well-read reader. This is maybe going to seem totally self-evident to you, but I think it's worth thinking about. And that is the question of whether you want to read or whether you just want to be well-read. So think about this in other situations in your life. There are things that we want to be able to say we've done or that we want to have done, but that we really don't want to be doing in the moment. A college degree might be an example of that. Probably there are very, very few people who enjoyed every moment of studying in college. And yet, because we wanted to be college educated, we were willing to go through the motions and sometimes obviously enjoy courses that we took and readings that we did and papers that we wrote, but certainly there were other times where we just had to kind of gut our way out and do it. If you are the kind of person who wants to be well-read but doesn't necessarily find the process enjoyable, then I think it's going to be pretty tough. The motivation to be a college graduate is really high. There are lots of social rewards for it and economic rewards. The reward for being a well-read person is really pretty much on you, something that you are going to appreciate. Maybe, it might impress some other people. They might say, oh, you're really well read, but that's hardly the kind of reward that you're looking for in a project like this. It has to be something that you are going to enjoy doing, not just being. So there's a little bit of self-reflection involved in here. Do you really enjoy setting aside big chunks of time to sit down and read? In that case, then you certainly are on your way to becoming a well-read reader. And then you might just want to put some more intent into what you're choosing to read if it's important to you to be more widely read or more culturally literate in your reading or more conversant in the Western canon or whatever it is. So if you're the kind of person who loves to read and is thinking about how could I choose the books that will make me more well-read, even how could I become a better reader of those books, then I've got some more videos for you. So coming up next is my video on becoming a well-read reader and helping you think through what are some of the things that you want to read and how are you going to find them? How are you going to figure out how to start or move on with this project of becoming a well-read reader? I want to end today's video with a quote from a piece in the Paris Review by John Jeremiah Sullivan, who wrote, "Never forget that well-educated people pretend to know, on average, at least 2/3 more books than they've actually read." So there's that element of posing as a well-read reader in there. It also begs the question, what does it mean to be well-educated, which I guess is a question for another time. The final thing that I want to share with you that he also said that I think is really gets at the heart of this question of are you well-read is something to keep in mind as you embark on this project, if that's what you're going to do. Sullivan says, it's not the where you start so much as the that you don't stop. I'll also leave some links for you below on other resources that you might want to use to think about what it means to be a well-read reader. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.